Imagine a small village in medieval England. The houses are made of wood and daub, huddled together around a muddy track that serves as a road. A farmer is mending a fence. A blacksmith is hammering at his forge. A woman is feeding chickens in her yard. It's a normal, quiet day. Suddenly, a man bursts out of a cottage, clutching a stolen loaf of bread. The woman who owns the bread runs out after him, shouting at the top of her lungs. "Stop him, thief! Stop the thief!" That shout is the beginning of the hue and cry. It wasn't just a panicked yell, it was a legal summons. The moment that cry went up, everything in the village was supposed to stop. The farmer had to drop his tools, the blacksmith had to leave his fire. Every able-bodied man within earshot had a legal duty to join the chase. They were expected to grab whatever was at hand, a pitchfork, a club, or just their own 2 feet, and run after the suspect. This wasn't a choice, it was the law. The term hue and cry itself tells you what it was about. The hue comes from an old French word huer, which means to shout or to cry out. It was the alarm, the noise that alerted everyone to a crime in progress. The cry was the chase itself, the pursuit of the offender by the community. So you had the shout and then you had the chase. It was a system of law enforcement that relied entirely on the public. There was no police force waiting for a call. The community was the police force. This idea was very old even for the medieval period. It had its roots in Anglo-Saxon England long before the Norman conquest in 1066. Early Germanic tribes had similar customs where the entire community was responsible for dealing with criminals. The thinking was simple and practical. In a world with no formal police, who else was going to catch a lawbreaker? Your neighbors, your safety was directly tied to your neighbor's willingness to help, and their safety was tied to yours. It was a system born of necessity. When the Normans took over England, they didn't get rid of this system. They strengthened it, they were skilled administrators, and they saw the value in making the community police itself. It was efficient, and more importantly, it was cheap. You didn't have to pay salaries for a standing army of lawmen to patrol every village. You just had to make it clear to the people that keeping the peace was their job. And if they failed, there would be consequences. So the hue and cry was more than just a posse chasing a bad guy in a movie. It is a deeply embedded legal and social obligation. It was a cornerstone of medieval justice for centuries. The sound of that shout was meant to trigger an immediate collective response. It turned ordinary people into temporary law enforcers. The peace of the realm didn't depend on a king's knight in shining armor showing up. It depended on a baker, a tanner, and a farmer all agreeing to drop what they were doing and run. It was a raw, direct, and sometimes messy form of justice built on the simple idea that a crime against one person was a crime against everyone. And everyone had a duty to do something about it. So how did the hue and cry actually work in practice? It wasn't just a chaotic mob running around. There was a method to the madness, a set of rules and expectations that everyone understood. It all started with the crime itself. For the hue and cry to be legitimate, the crime had to be fresh. The suspect had to be caught in the act or immediately after. This wasn't for solving old mysteries. This was for dealing with a problem that was happening right now. The first step was raising the alarm. The victim or a witness had to shout. They had to make it clear that a serious crime, usually a felony like theft, assault, or murder, had just occurred. The shout was the trigger, but it wasn't always just a voice. People might also blow a horn. The sound of a horn carried a long way and was a clear signal of trouble. In some places, the church bells would be rung in a specific way to signal a hue and cry, calling everyone from the fields and workshops. The goal was to alert as many people as possible as quickly as possible. Once the alarm was raised, the duty to respond was immediate. Every man between the ages of 15 and 60 was legally required to join the chase. You didn't get to finish your lunch. You didn't get to put your tools away neatly. You stopped what you were doing and you ran. This was not a volunteer activity. It was a legal obligation as serious as paying taxes. The local official, often a constable or a reeve, would take charge of the pursuit if he was present, but his presence wasn't necessary to get things started. The community itself was expected to act. People would grab whatever they could use as a weapon. This wasn't an army, so most people didn't have swords or professional arms. They brought what they used in their daily lives. Farmers brought pitchforks and scythes, craftsmen brought hammers and cudgels. Anything that could be used to intimidate or subdue a suspect was fair game. The image is one of a ragtag group of villagers, armed with the tools of their trade, becoming a temporary police force. The chase itself could be relentless. The group would pursue the suspect, shouting and making noise to keep the alarm going. If the suspect ran out of the village and into the fields, the chase continued. And here is where the system got really clever. If the pursuit crossed into the jurisdiction of the next village, the duty was passed on. The pursuers from the first village would shout to the people of the second village, and those people were then obligated to take up the chase. The hue and cry could, in theory, pass from village to village across the entire county. The criminal would find no rest, no safe haven where people would ignore the problem. Every community he ran through was another group of people legally bound to try and stop him. This system was supported by another Anglo-Saxon institution called the tithing, later known as the Frank Pledge system. This was a brilliant piece of social engineering. Society was organized into groups of about 10 households, called a tithing. All the men in that tithing were collectively responsible for the conduct of everyone else in their group. If one man in the tithing committed a crime and fled, the other 9 were held responsible. They would be fined heavily if they failed to produce him for the court. This put immense social pressure on everyone to behave. It also meant that when the hue and cry was raised, everyone in the tithing had a strong financial incentive to catch the culprit. It wasn't just about civic duty, it was about protecting their own wallets. If your neighbor stole a pig and ran off, you and the rest of your tithing group would have to pay a hefty fine if you couldn't catch him. This ensured that people took the hue and cry very seriously. It wasn't just about helping a victim. It was about avoiding a collective punishment. Once the suspect was caught, the hue and cry ended. The crowd was not supposed to administer justice on the spot, though this sometimes happened in the heat of the moment. The proper procedure was to turn the captured person over to the local constable or sheriff. From there, the formal legal process would begin, with the suspect held for trial at the next court session. The hue and cry was the first step in the justice system, the apprehension. It was the community's job to catch the accused. It was the court's job to decide their guilt or innocence. The hue and cry wasn't just a good idea or a village custom. It was the law of the land, and the law had teeth. For centuries, this system was enforced by the threat of punishment. The duty to participate was not optional, and ignoring it was a crime in itself. The entire legal framework was designed to make sure that when the shout went up, people moved. The rules were formalized over time. One of the most important pieces of legislation was the Statute of Winchester, passed in 1285 under King Edward I. This law didn't invent the hue and cry, but it standardized it and wrote it into the National Legal Code. The statute made it crystal clear what was expected of every community. It stated that the cry shall be made in all counties, hundreds, markets, fairs, and all other places where great resort of people is. And it confirmed that everyone was bound to follow the cry. So what happened if you heard the shout and decided to stay home? What if you were busy and just didn't feel like chasing a thief? You could be in serious trouble. A person who failed to join the hue and cry could be brought before the local court and fined. The fines were not trivial. They were designed to be painful enough to make you think twice about ignoring your duty next time. The court records from the period are filled with cases of people being amerced or fined for this very offense. It was considered a neglect of a fundamental civic duty, like a modern person refusing to do jury service, but with a more immediate and physical component. The punishment wasn't just for individuals, the community as a whole could be held liable. If a crime was committed in a village and the villagers failed to raise the hue and cry, or they raised it but failed to pursue the offender to the border of their territory, the entire village could be fined. This collective responsibility was a powerful motivator. It meant that your neighbors would pressure you to participate. Nobody wanted to be the reason that the whole village had to pay a fine to the king's treasury. This is where the Frankish system connected directly with the hue and cry. The failure of one was the failure of all, and the punishment would be shared by all. But the law also had to protect against abuse of the system. What if someone had a grudge against a neighbor and decided to raise a false hue and cry? Shouting thief without cause could create chaos and potentially lead to an innocent person being harmed by a mob. The law recognized this danger. Raising a hue and cry unjustly was also a punishable offense. If you started a chase without a legitimate reason, you would be the one facing the court and paying a fine. This was meant to ensure that the system was used only for genuine emergencies. The power to summon the entire community to action was not to be taken lightly. The role of officials like the constable was also important. The constable was a local man, often a peasant or a craftsman, appointed to the role for a year. He wasn't a professional police officer. He had his own farm or business to run. But he was the community's legal representative. He was expected to lead the hue and cry and to keep any captured suspects in custody until they could be handed over to the sheriff. The Statute of Winchester also required towns to have a watch at night, especially during the summer months, to look out for strangers and be ready to raise the alarm. The system created a clear chain of responsibility. The victim shouts, the community chases. The constable takes custody, the sheriff transports to jail, the court delivers judgment. The hue and cry was the first, critical link in that chain. Without it, the rest of the system couldn't function. The law made it clear that this link was not to be broken. The threat of fines for individuals and entire communities ensured that for a very long time, the system held together. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a system with clear rules and real consequences for anyone who failed to play their part. Like any system designed by humans, the hue and cry had its strengths and its weaknesses. It survived for centuries because, in many ways, it was very effective for the world in which it existed. But it also had significant flaws that became more apparent as society changed. It was a product of its time, perfectly suited for some situations and completely inadequate for others. One of its biggest strengths was its suitability for small, rural communities. In a medieval village, everybody knew everybody else. They knew their neighbors, their habits, and their business. A stranger stood out immediately. If a crime was committed, the pool of local suspects was small and well known. When the hue and cry was raised, the community wasn't just chasing a faceless criminal, they were often chasing someone they knew, or they were looking for the one person who didn't belong. This made it a powerful tool for social control. The constant oversight of your neighbors was a strong deterrent. The thought that the entire village would instantly mobilize to chase you down was probably enough to prevent a lot of crime in the first place. Another major advantage was the cost. The hue and cry was, essentially, free. The king and the local lords did not have to fund a professional police force. The community provided its own security. This was incredibly important in a pre-modern economy where state resources were limited. The system ran on civic duty and the threat of fines, not on salaries and budgets. It placed the burden of law enforcement directly on the people, saving the authorities a huge amount of money and manpower. The system also fostered a strong sense of collective responsibility. It reinforced the idea that public safety was everyone's business. Your neighbor's stolen chicken was your problem too, because the breakdown of order affected the entire community. This shared duty could strengthen social bonds and create a sense of solidarity. In a world without much of a safety net, knowing that your neighbors were legally obligated to come to your aid provided a basic level of security. However, the weaknesses of the system were significant. The biggest problem was its reliance on a chase. The hue and cry was designed to catch a criminal in the act. It was completely useless for investigating a crime that was discovered later. If a farmer found one of his sheep missing in the morning, there was no one to chase. If a house was burgled while the owner was away, there was no hue and cry to raise. The system had no detectives, no investigators, and no way to handle crimes that required more than simply running after a suspect you could see. The system also struggled in larger towns and cities. As urban centers grew, they became more anonymous. You didn't know everyone on your street. Strangers were common. A criminal could easily melt into a crowd, making a chase much more difficult. The close-knit community fabric that made the hue and cry work in a small village was absent in a bustling town like London. The passing of the cry from one jurisdiction to the next also became more complicated and less effective in a dense urban environment. There was also the very real danger of mob justice. The hue and cry could quickly turn a group of neighbors into an angry mob. In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping, the crowd might not be interested in waiting for a formal trial. Mistaken identity was a serious risk. An innocent person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time could be caught by the mob and beaten or killed before anyone had a chance to sort out the facts. The system relied on the crowd to show restraint, and that was not always guaranteed. Furthermore, the effectiveness of the chase depended entirely on the willingness and ability of the public. While it was a legal duty, enforcement could be spotty. People might be old, sick, or physically unable to join a chase. Others might simply not want to risk their own safety to catch a potentially violent criminal. A farmer with a pitchfork is no match for a determined and well-armed robber. Over time, as society became more individualistic, people became less willing to drop everything to enforce the law themselves. They began to see it as someone else's job. This shift in attitude would ultimately lead to the system's decline. The hue and cry was a brilliant solution for its time, but that time would not last forever. The hue and cry was a remarkably durable system, lasting in English law for the better part of 1,000 years. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, it was creaking under the strain of a changing world. The forces that had made it so effective in a feudal, agrarian society were the very things that made it obsolete in an industrial one. Its decline was slow and gradual but inevitable. The single biggest factor in its demise was the Industrial Revolution. This period saw a massive shift in population from the rural countryside to the cities. Towns like Manchester, Liverpool, and London exploded in size. They became vast, sprawling, and anonymous places. The old model of the tight-knit village where everyone knew each other was gone. In a city of 1 million people, you could commit a crime and disappear into the crowd within minutes. The hue and cry, which depended on community knowledge and a chase across open fields, was utterly unsuited for the narrow, crowded streets of an industrial slum. With urbanization came new types of crime and a new class of professional criminals. Law enforcement was no longer about catching a neighbor who stole a chicken. It was about dealing with organized gangs, sophisticated thieves, and the widespread social disorder that came with poverty and overcrowding. A mob of citizens armed with sticks was no match for this new reality. The public, especially the growing middle class, began to feel that the old system was not keeping them safe. They started to demand a more professional and organized approach to crime. At the same time, attitudes were changing. The idea of personal responsibility was shifting. People increasingly saw law enforcement as a specialized job, something the government should provide in exchange for taxes. A merchant or a factory owner didn't want to have to close his business and chase a pickpocket down the street. He wanted a paid professional to handle it. The old sense of collective, legally enforced duty was being replaced by a modern desire for professional public services. The first experiments with professional policing began to appear. In London, the Bow Street Runners were established in the mid-18th century. They were a small, dedicated group of men who investigated crimes and pursued criminals, acting as an early detective force. They were a step towards a new model, but they were still a tiny force. The real turning point came in 1829, when Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, established the London Metropolitan Police. This was a radical innovation. For the first time, London had a large, uniformed, and professional police force. Its officers were paid a salary, wore a uniform to be easily identified, and patrolled the city on organized beats. Their job was not to react to a cry, but to prevent crime through their visible presence. This was the birth of modern policing as we know it. The idea was a huge success and quickly spread to other cities and towns across Britain and then around the world. As professional police forces grew, the hue and cry faded into irrelevance. It remained on the statute books for a long time, a relic of a bygone era, but it was no longer used. Why would you raise a hue and cry when you could summon a trained constable? The new system was more efficient, more reliable, and better suited to the complexities of modern life. The legal requirement for ordinary citizens to join a chase was finally abolished in the 19th century. But does any legacy of the hue and cry remain today? In a way, it does. The concept of a citizen's arrest is a distant cousin. It's the idea that a private citizen can, under very specific circumstances, detain someone who has committed a crime. This reflects the old notion that the public has a role to play in law enforcement, even if it's a much more limited one. More broadly, we can see echoes of the hue and cry in modern community-based crime prevention. Programs like Neighborhood Watch are based on the same principle of collective responsibility that underpinned the medieval system. The idea is that a community is safer when its members look out for one another and report suspicious activity. Of course, the modern version involves calling the professional police, not grabbing a pitchfork and starting a chase. Even modern technologies have their own version of the hue and cry, an Amber Alert, which sends a notification to thousands of mobile phones about a missing child, is a form of digital alarm. It's a way of instantly summoning the eyes and ears of the entire community to help in a search. It's a modern shout that uses technology instead of lung power to alert everyone to an emergency. The medieval hue and cry itself is long gone. It belongs to a world that no longer exists. But the fundamental question it tried to answer remains with us. How do we keep our communities safe? The hue and cry was one answer, built for its time. It placed the responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the community. Today, we rely more on professional services, but the idea that we all have a small part to play in the safety and well-being of our neighbors has never completely disappeared. It's the faint, lingering echo of a time when justice began with a simple shout.